Hi and welcome to another tutorial from Holmes. Today we're looking at the 3 ways to connect scenes in Blender. So when we're talking about scenes now, we're not referring directly or exclusively to Blender's ability to create scenes in the outliner. No, in this situation we're talking about the general purpose of scenes, right? The general understanding what a scene is. And a scene is essentially a timestamp, a time period in an entire movie length that has a series of connected actions and events that correlate to each other, usually in continuous action or continuous motion. So this is what a scene is. So typically you see scenes represented as style frames. Even though style frames focus more on the stylistic composition, it typically captures the essence of what a scene is. Also you'll see animatics that flesh out more on style frame type of information that will take a look at more of the motion and the intended feel of what you want in that scene. That is essentially a scene, right? You can also think of scenes as in the panels that we see in a comic book, all very similar concepts. We taught some of it in the Stomp tutorial, right? But we're going to look at it in more depth here, and we're going to go into some of the secrets that I use to create my motion graphics in Blender. So the 3 ways to connect scenes in Blender. The first way is through the camera markers, the second way is through the Compositor window, and the third way is through the video editor. Cool, let's go. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the first way to connect scenes, which is the camera markers. Alright, and I think I have a project in front of me, and I think this project is perfect for demonstrating how camera markers can be used to connect scenes in Blender. Now, if you've not seen this project before, or if you've checked my Instagram, you would have seen it there, even though there's some updates to this one. It's a simple logo intro, and we're gonna show you how we're gonna show you the logo intro, so you can see what it looks like, and then we're going to deconstruct it in terms of how it uses camera binding markers to separate scenes. Alright, let's just go ahead and hover over this, hit Control and Spacebar, and this is the middle mouse button to zoom in. So we're just gonna play this from the beginning, Control and Spacebar, so you can get an idea of what this looks like. Okay, this is the logo intro, and this is what we're going to be using to show you the camera markers, right, and how useful they are. So this logo intro has 2 scenes, right? The first scene is the scene where the lightning strikes from the sky, comes down and strikes the signal text, and then there's a white blowout. The second scene starts from about here, and that's where the triangle reveals itself to reveal the signal, or recludes itself to reveal the signal text and the sky, and we have the lightning come down to reveal the strike text, as well as the triangle to reveal the lightning bolt icon. Cool, so these are the 2 different scenes, the first scene and the second scene, and we use camera markers to navigate between the 2 scenes. Now, I'll just delete this marker here. We've gone over the mechanical technicalities of the camera markers pretty extensively in the Stomp text tutorial. I'll leave a link to that in the description. We've covered it quite extensively there, so there's not going to be much new material in this tutorial about the mechanics of it. Where the new material comes is the best practices and implementation of the camera binders in your scene to connect between scenes. So if we take a look at our timeline, we can see 2 markers here. We have one here where it says camera 3 at frame 40, and we have one here at frame 99 where it says camera 4. These are the 2 cameras that we use to navigate between. So a marker essentially is when we press M on our keyboard while our mouse is hovering the dope sheet, the timeline editor, and the video editor. I've not tested in the graph editor, but I wouldn't be surprised if you can do it there too. And essentially it just creates a dotted line with a triangle. So let's go ahead and press M on our keyboard. right? And we have created a marker here, and we can see the dotted line and we see the triangle, and we see the others are grayed out because this marker, this new created marker, is the active marker. Now we can rename this marker by making sure it's selected and active and pressing F2, right? Just like we can name other things in Blender, we can rename it, and we can also move this by pressing G and X once it's active, and we can move this along the timeline in on whatever frame we choose to put it. So markers are incredibly useful for animators, motion graphic designers, and live video creators, right? It's incredibly useful outside of the camera binding techniques because it's a marker. It helps us with our organization. So for example, when I'm doing my video editing to produce a video for YouTube, I use markers extensively. When I scrub through the video, I say, okay, this is a good place to put the subscribe button. This is a good place to put the Patreon ad. This is a good place to put the reference to another video. This is an excellent place to input some B-roll. That's why markers are so useful in Blender, because they help with the organization of content. Very, very useful tool. But in the case of connecting scenes, this usefulness comes from the fact that we can bind cameras to these markers, and to do that we simply have to select the camera that we want to be active at this particular frame in the scene, and then we come back to the dope sheet editor and we hit Control and B, and that the B stands for bind, and we can bind the camera to that marker. Right? Or we can go to marker and go to bind cameras to marker, right? But this will only work if you selected the camera in the scene and then you go over and bind the camera to that marker. Just make sure that you hovered over the frame of the marker that you want it to bind to, and that it's active, and it will bind to that marker. At that point, you're going to get a camera icon here, and it's going to rename the marker to the name that you have for the camera. So this is why it's useful to name the camera in case you have several of them. This is absolutely fantastic, a fantastic tool, and incredibly useful. Now, because at this situation now, we have a case now where we can add several different scenes, or create several different scenes within one Blender scene. And out of all the techniques that we are going to talk about, the other two, all three of them, this is the only technique for connecting scenes that you can achieve this with, which makes this method the most economical method in terms of connecting scenes, right? It's also very clutter free. Right? So what I mean by clutter free is that because it's a different camera, all of the elements created for this scene, you can move to a different area. So even though this is an excellent tool for connecting scenes, right, there is some best practices and some techniques that I'm going to teach you about how to utilize it that you should be considering when using this type of scene connector. So we're going to take a look at some of these best practices now. So the first thing you need to consider when using a camera binding marker as a scene connector is the element bleed, what I call element bleed. And what that is essentially is if we come out of camera view and look at the two cameras separately. All right, let's take a look. This is the camera here. We're going to go ahead and just change the world color so things are a bit easier to see. I'm going to change it to like white, and let me move this from transparent so we can see these cameras a bit easier, find them a bit easier. All right, see them here, 1, 2. Cool. So if we take a look at where these cameras are located, we see that there's a healthy amount of distance between it, but you'll have to navigate to each camera via the viewport to make sure that the elements that are part of the first camera or the previous camera or even the camera that comes after do not bleed into the new camera element that you've created, right, and the new active camera that your frame is currently working with, right? Because you don't want this blue background to show in the background of this camera. So you want to make sure you give it a healthy amount of space to stop element bleed. So that's one. Number two, you want to be thinking about parallax. Now parallax can be intended or unintended, right? Just in the same way that you may actually want the element bleed to happen, even though in most cases you don't want that, right? And let's show you what we mean by parallax. So if I grab this lightning bolt here, let's hit G and X, bring it across. Cool. And we can see that this lightning bolt and the signal text have a different Z depth. So we just hold the middle mouse button and zoom out. We can see that the lightning bolt and the text are different Z locations. We can see it here. Yeah, this is better. It's easier to see. As such, right, because they are different Z locations, this may seem like it's in the center of the signal text, but in reality, because of the Z difference, it's not actually there. So when we begin to create a new camera and we begin to move elements, we may find that the elements are moving sort of strangely, like they're not moving at the same distance, and this can distort your perception of the composition of the scene. So when creating a new camera, you have to keep in mind that the parallax is going to make the elements seem weird. That's why I advise, when using this technique, and even for majority of the techniques in all of them, right, but for this one especially, you want to make sure that when you have different elements that are supposed to be connected to each other, that the Z depth between them is as minimal as possible to avoid parallax error. So you want to be cognizant of parallax error. Cool. Now for the last thing that you need to consider when dealing with camera markers as your scene transition tool, you want to make sure that you understand the limits of your resources. I find that typically for cameras with medium enough complexity in terms of the animation for each scene is about the limit that I can do before Blender becomes very laggy. Right? So you want to understand your own setup, and you want to make sure that you don't have too much lag, because wherever there's lag, it's very frustrating to sort of navigate between each one of the cameras, and mistakes can compile with your frustration, and the impatience of the whole scene switching can lead to a complete nightmare. Right, so those are the three things you need to consider. You need to consider your parallax error, you need to consider element bleed, and you need to consider your resources. Right, but outside of that, this is the most economic scene transition tool. The camera markers, fantastic tool for your motion graphic and your video composition needs. Okay, we're going to look at the Compositor for connecting scenes in Blender. Alright, so I have my logo in front of me here, my logo intro. I think this is the best project I have to explain connection of scenes in Blender via the Compositor nodes. I don't use scenes per se, I use render layers, but the two are basically identical in the way that they mechanically function. So if we take a look at the logo here, all of you should be well aware. You'll be well familiar with my logo intro, right? And this is it. It's seen here with the background. Let's just take a look at if we zoom out of camera of the logo intro, and we see the hummingbird, but we don't see the text. And the reason is that to alpha out the text such that the text is seen the way I want it to be seen on the logo, right? And I don't want the mask that's masking the logo to affect the background here. I put that text on a different render layer, and you can do that by going to your top right. Right, on the left is scenes, on the right is render layers, and render layers are like subsections of scenes where you can decide what is visible and what is not visible. This is where the holdout mask is the most useful when dealing with render layers, right? So in this situation, I have a main, which is my background, all of my elements, and then I have alpha, which is where my text is. Good, so you can see the text here with the alpha. So if I wanted to show you everything together, I would just simply toggle on the text and you'd see it here. Cool. And you can see the toggle here. This gray here is my alpha mask, which I don't want to show on my background or affect my background, and so I have the alpha processing done on a separate render layer. Cool. Then to complete the process, we have to go over to the Compositor window, and we can see how this looks. So the magic is with this node here, alpha over, and we have our two render layers connected together. So why I say that joining scenes and joining render layers is basically identical process, because it's the same node and that you do use to do both of them basically. If we look up here where this cone is and circle, this is our scene, and we can add scenes here. Cool. And if we look below that, we have our render layers. So you see our render layer here and render layer here. So we're using main and alpha with the same scene, but we can use different scenes to connect the scenes together. Now I've only able to get 2 to work as of recent. I get errors when I try to add more than 2. So that's one limitation of this method, that you can only really add 2. If you know how to add more than one alpha, that means stacking the alpha over node, so you get another one and you get functionality, just let me know. But the limitation for me is 2. And even if you were to add others, because of the resource hog of the compositor node, it's not very worth it in the long run to really use the compositor node to connect scenes, right? Which leads to the next problem. When you're using this method, the compositor renders both scenes together as you render for the output, and that means double the work. So it renders both the camera zoom scene main and the camera zoom scene alpha together, and that's double the processing, which means double the time. Means double the work on the processing unit or the graphics card, whatever you're using to render, and it means it takes longer time and more resource power to complete. So that's a problem with this method. I really only suggest it for smaller projects, but it's still a very useful way to connect scenes together and very effective way to connect them together. To reduce the time for which the compositor may work and to reduce the workload, I would suggest that you set the timeline for each scene such that it starts exactly when the animation and the events happen on that scene. So if your first scene starts from 0 to 50 frames and your second scene starts from 50 frames to 100 frames, then you want that scene to start from 50 to 100 frames. You don't want it to start from 0 to 100 frames. So what you want to do here is just navigate over to your render panel here, go over to your frame start, and you would set this exactly where the scene starts. So that way the compositor doesn't render extra frames in a scene that's not necessary, and that will help to reduce some of the time as well. So great method right here. It's fairly simple, excellent for alphas and stuff like that when you're in a pinch and you need a global alpha mask that you know will work. The compositor node is a great go-to for connecting scenes, but I only suggest it for smaller projects. Okay, so we're moving on to the final part of connecting scenes in Blender, the video sequencer. So this is the big daddy of the 3 methods in terms of getting the scenes together and connected together in one Blender file. Good, I'm going to be using my motion graphic that I posted to represent this part here. If we take a look at it quickly, let's just go for the education, please just take a look at it quickly. Is this one?
The African Center perspectives behind we're looking at education. Bold and thoughtful young man.
Cool. Now there's some changes to the motion graphic in this project file, but it's still sufficient enough that you can follow along and see how this is done. So let's go over to the file itself. We're in the Blender file for this. Let's first take a look at the outline and how I've organized the scenes. So you need to organize your scenes and name them appropriately. I highly recommend that you do this, or else you're gonna end up in a lot of problems or a lot of confusion over time, especially as the project increases in size and you begin to find that you're moving objects from one scene to the next. So I have my scenes labeled here: scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4. This is what works for me. If you have another naming convention, you can use that also. One of the things to keep in mind why you need to label this is because Blender will put the scene at the top that is the last and most frequently used. So if you have a situation now where you don't name them, you could be working on a scene and expect it to be in a certain order, and then when you go and see that shifted order, you may get confused, right? So Blender moves the scene that is most used or that was used last to the top of the chain here. So it's a last is it last in first out type of thing. So my last one was scene 4, the principal components, and the one before that was scene 5, the wave reveal, right? But the order is here. Once I see the numbers, I know what the proper order is, and I know how to construct my mental thoughts as to determine which one I want to go to. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Cool. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, when creating the scenes, right, you want to make sure that the scene that you're creating for your video editor, to combine the scenes, I call mine scene 6 final combination. That name works for me. You may think of something else, but that scene cannot have any data in the layout view. So we're in the layout view right now, and we notice that this scene has no data in it. If we go to say scene 1, we can see that we have data in the layout view, and the reason for this is quite simple, right? The video editor, the video sequence editor, overlaps any data in the layout view, so it makes no sense, right, that you have layout data in that in that video sequence editor scene. Cool. That's why you should have a separate file for it that doesn't have any layout data in it, because that data is going to get overwritten anyway, so there's no point in having it. So I suggest that you create a separate file, a separate scene for the combination of your scenes. Cool. Let's take a look at the scenes quickly there so that we can set the context for the video editor. Here is the principle of 4 first scene. Let's go into the camera mode so you can see it. Right. And we have the principle of 4 here. Good. I have music attached to this, but I have turned the music off. Oh, I think I've taken it off because I already knew this one, but you should have music here if you're using it. Let me just go back to Adobe Sheet Editor. Let's go to the scene 2 typography. This has this music in it though. Yeah, you can hear the music playing. Oh, so it ends with white. It starts with white here, and the first scene ends with white. So we use the same zoom principle here. So as it zooms into the 4, we can see it zooming into the white part of the 4, and the final scene is a white section. Cool. Something like this. So we can see it's entirely white, and so when we start the education one or the typography one, it starts at white too. Cool. And it continues with the zoom in animation that we had. Then we move on to the crowns, and as the crown is falling with gravity, we use the momentum of the gravity to move into the next scene, which is the third scene here, to the world, and we see the crown fall on Tuma's head. Cool. It turns over, and with this transition now, there's no motion movement. We just use a simple stinger transition. That's the name of it, and that's where we use multiple layers of animation to move on to a next one. I also call it a PowerPoint animation, but it's totally usable and feasible. It's just a different type of transition. We'll be looking at different types of transitions in a separate tutorial, and we'll be looking at different type of stinger animations for motion graphics in a separate tutorial as well, so you can look for that. Let's go to it quickly so we can see it. Cool. So we go to the start, we see the shields just kind of show up and overlap what was already there. So all of these layers kind of go over the original scene to reveal the new scene. And in this section now, we have a situation where we have more than one scene, one-on-one motion scene inside of a Blender scene. And this is where I use the Z depth technique to add different scenes. Now this is a way to add scenes to Blender. I haven't separated it as one of the 3 because I don't think this is a method that you should be using in the beginning, because it can get very confusing and messy if you don't know what you're doing. But essentially it works very similar to the scene with the camera markers, essentially, but we're just using Z depth instead of camera markers to create new scenes. So if we take a look at this scene, these scenes here, we can see this is the first scene, this is the second scene, and where this comes over will be the third transition scene. Cool. So if we play it, just to bring this into context, so that we have it, let me just bring up the camera pass apart value so it looks more like we're seeing it. Go to the end of it. Alright, cool. So scene 1 is scene 2, and then when this is finished now, we have Tuma go over it with the, as he walks over it, carries over the next scene here, and this is scene 3, and this is all in one blender scene. So you can use Z depth, but only if you have a good comprehension of it, or else you'll make a mess basically. But this is another economic way to add scenes in Blender that you can use. Cool. So with that, we can go into the VSC because we understand how the scenes work and we have them labeled. So let's go into the video sequence editor. Let's go here. Now to add a scene in the video sequence editor, we simply hit Shift and A and go to scene, and we just add our scene. And when we import the scene, it comes in like a strip, like a video strip. So this looks very similar to a non-linear video editor, say like Kden Live or Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro. Very, very similar in structure, right? Those who are old in it, like Sony Vegas and those type of things, or OpenCut, OpenShot, also the same way. It's very same method, right? Just that you use scenes that you've created. Now we can get into, so we just join them together, and if you want one scene to go over the other, we just simply put it over the scene. Cool. And we can see this is where the stinger animation shows up, and also this is where the logo outro comes up as well over the original, right? We have our music here, and we have our voice over here, and we also have some sound effects here. So let's take a look at some of the problems with this method now. All right, the first problem I want you to think about with this method, well, you can see almost immediately, is that the colors and that are represented in the original scenes are not truly represented in the video editor. All right, as you see, we have shades of gray here at the top, and it's not quite as represented. It's like a rendered down version that's easier to play, and I think this is good, right? So when you have the other scenes in the same Blender file, it's not too much of a problem. You can always go back to those scenes to see what the colors are like and test them, and you should be doing it in that section. You shouldn't be doing it here. This is just for the combination of scenes and to make sure things are seamless, right? So you, in the view editor, you're not going to see the colors true to life. That's 1. 2, right? You're going to have problems with syncing music. The first thing you should know about music when dealing with this method is that any music that's in the VSC of those prior scenes will not show up in this the VSC editor here. So all of that music that you heard in, say, the typography side of things, typography scene, that will not show up in the VSC here, right? The only music that's going to show on this scene is the music that we put in this VSC editor, right? These VSC slides right here. So you're going to have to sync the music back and forth. Now with a little bit of time and practice and knowledge, that will become second nature, but in the beginning that will be a bit of a headache to sync music, but that's something you have to consider. This is more difficult to sync music with than the first method and the second method. Cool, a second method to join scenes, right? So the next part of it is that you need to consider as a problem is resources. So as long you can move the strips pretty well, there's no lag here, but as long as you move the mouse over the timeline keeper here, that's this blue line, you're gonna get some lagging here, and depending on the complexity of the scene will also depend on the lag that you get. So you have to keep this in mind. The more you add is the more lag you'll get, but this is pretty, I think this is pretty efficient in my opinion. I don't get much lag with this. Even scrubbing manually, I don't get much problems. You can see it here, barely any issues. It goes through pretty nicely, yeah. And so you have to keep in mind your resources. So those are the 3 problems that you would have when dealing with this. Cool. we've gone through the mechanics, we've gone through the slides, we've gone through the problems, and we've gone through some of the best practices. This is the best method to combine scenes, as in Blender scenes, in Blender, in my opinion. The most hassle-free. The only thing is that you have to know what you're doing. Name your scenes. Make sure the VSC editing scene is on its own scene. There's no layout data associated with it, and be cognizant that you will have to do majority of your music syncing in the aforementioned scenes rather than the VSC, and then match it with the VSC afterwards. And typically in this type of technique, you want to avoid linking as much as possible, or if you link, make sure you duplicate the element before you link to a new scene. So if this camera is linked to, say, scene 3, if I move the camera in scene 3, then it will move the camera in scene 4, and that will just cause all sorts of mess and mayhem. So what I do particularly is that when I want to use the same camera and I'm creating a new scene, I'll duplicate it with Shift and D, easy, and then I'll link it with Control and L, link it to whatever scene I want to link it to, and then I'll just delete the duplicate. And that way I have the exact same camera with the same sort of featuring, but it's a different camera than what it was before, and I don't have to worry about me editing that camera to affect this one, because nothing is more annoying than when you've added an element of one scene to another and then you've changed it and it's changed the element in the prior scene that you did not want to be changed. So I advise that you duplicate the element, link it, and then delete it. That way the integrity of your original scene is kept, right? And even though this is a long talk because it's so many years of experience, this is my advice on how to connect scenes in Blender. That is the camera markers, that is the compositor, and that's the video editor. This is my best, most solid advice for all of the pain points I've experienced over the years on this thing, all of the issues I've had to go through to create motion graphics, and you will not find a more comprehensive tutorial on how to deal with this thing in Blender space. It is not easy to understand, and it has not been easy to determine the problems over the years and how to fix it. And it doesn't just stop here. We're gonna have to talk about how to make elements disappear in Blender, because that's also a big part of scene connection in this, right? Not just the animating of elements in to be visible, but how we get rid of them so they don't interfere with the next elements that we do. So we'll have another tutorial on that. It won't be as long as this one, but we'll have another tutorial on that where we talk about best practices to remove elements from a scene so they don't interfere with other things. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I know it's a bit wordy, but there's really no other way to explain it outside of kind of talking to you. I hope you benefit from this. Please use this to your advantage. I had to learn the hard way. I don't want you to learn any harder than I have to learn. And you could go a far way by just taking some of the tips that I've given you in this video and applying it to your own project. Good luck with your own project. Good luck with your own motion graphics, live video editing, and animations for grease pencil users as well. And I wish you all the best. So until I see you again with another tutorial, get up and design a new dawn. Later.